Hello, everyone. My name is Lilani Nelson. I'm the Associate Director and Research Fellow at the Center for Ag and Food Systems here at Vermont Law Graduate School. And I'm excited to welcome you to the 2022 Hot Topics and Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. And today is our final Hot Topics presentation, which is crazy that it's already August and here we are. So we're really excited to have you all here today. And I just want to do a few reminders before we get started. Each talk is worth 1 Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of which talks you attend for your own records. And we will have some time for question and answer after today's presentation. For those of you that are watching on the VLGS YouTube or Facebook, you can enter questions in the chat or in the comment space, and we'll get through as many of those as we can after Emily gives her talk. So today we are very, very, very pleased. I'm very excited to be able to do this, to announce and introduce Emily Broad Leib as our speaker. Professor Broad Leib is a clinical professor in law and director and founder of the Food Law and Policy Clinic at the Center for Health Law and Policy and Innovation at Harvard Law School. And she launched the first law school clinic in the nation devoted to providing clients with legal and policy solutions to address the health, economic, and environmental challenges facing our food system. Professor Broad Leib focuses her scholarship, teaching, and practice on finding solutions to some of today's biggest food law issues, aiming to increase access to healthy food, eliminating food waste, and supporting sustainable food production and local and regional food systems. She also has published scholarly articles in the California Law Review, Wisconsin Law Review, the Harvard Law and Policy Review, the Food and Drug Law Journal, the Journal of Food Law and Policy, among many others. And Professor Broad Leib is recognized as a national leader in food law and policy. She was named by Fortune and Food and Wine to their list of 2016's most innovative women in food and drink. This list highlights women who had the most transformative impact in the last year on what the public eats and drinks. So it's a huge accomplishment. Professor Broad Leib was also one of the inaugural recipients of Harvard President Drew Faust's Climate Change Solutions Fund in 2015, and her project was reducing food waste as a key to addressing climate change. It was one of 7 that were chosen from around the university to confront the challenges of climate change by leveraging her clinic's food law and policy expertise to identify the systemic solutions that can reduce food waste, which is a major driver of climate change. And before joining the Harvard faculty, Professor Broad Leib was the joint Harvard Law School and Mississippi State University Delta Fellow, serving as the director of the Delta Directions Consortium, which is a group of university and foundation leaders who collaborate to improve public health and foster economic development in the Delta. And she received her BA from Columbia University and her JD from Harvard Law School. And Professor Broad Leib joins us this summer as the 2022 Distinguished Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Scholar at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Today, she will present her talk, which is A Recipe for Sustainability, Global Best Practices to Combat Food Waste and Food Insecurity. Please join me in welcoming Emily Broad Leib. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Emily.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lilani, for the warm introduction. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, hopefully that's working. Well, I want to start by just giving a huge thank you to Vermont Law School. It's been so nice to be here the last few weeks. I've had a really great time spending time with the team in CAVS and the Environmental Law Center, getting to meet a lot of the other folks who are teaching here and the other summer scholars. So it's been wonderful. I'm really sad that I have to leave in just a few days. So I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about a project that we've been working on at the Food Law and Policy Clinic for the past few years, which is the Global Food Donation Policy Atlas. And so as you heard from the introduction, I direct the Food Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard Law School. And what that means is that we are really a program devoted to 2 main goals. One is providing resources for clients who can be government agencies, nonprofits, community groups, startups, helping them better understand the laws that regulate the food system and think about and implement policy changes. And at the same time, as a clinic, we're engaging students in all aspects of that work as part of their learning about the laws that regulate the food system and about how to be lawyers involved in policy change. So the project I'm going to talk about today, we've had now more than 25 students, both Harvard Law students during the school year, and then in the summer, we have interns from across the country that have worked on all of this research, as well as many of my amazing staff. And I also want to thank our partners, the Global Food Banking Network, which is, as you'll hear, has been a big partner in this project. They're based in the U.S., but also we have partners in 23 different countries that are local NGOs that have been involved. And then the project as a whole has been supported by Walmart Foundation. So very grateful for their support for this. So I don't know if you can tell online what this is, but it's a giant field of onions. This photo was taken in April 2020, right at the start of the COVID pandemic. And as many people will recall, there were all of these images coming out in 2020, like this one, of onions or potatoes or gallons and gallons and jugs of milk being poured out, of animals being euthanized. So there was a huge crisis in the food system, and it suddenly became very apparent and visually apparent to so many people how much food was going to waste. Of course, that moment was an extreme example, but what's not always that apparent is how much food is being wasted day in, day out here in the U.S. and around the globe. In outside of COVID time. So in the US, estimates show that we waste between around 35 to 40% of our food supply on an average year at all levels of the food system. And this is really a global issue. I love showing this slide. The map is slightly outdated, but it's the best one for making one point that I really like to make, which is that food waste and food loss are global challenges. As you can see here, there's millions of tons of food wasted every year in every region of the globe. But the other thing that this shows is that the places along the food chain where food is wasted really vary. So for example, you can see in North America is the one region of the globe where the orange circle is larger than the blue. And what that means is we're the one region where food that's really discarded by consumers or consumer-facing businesses at the end of the supply chain exceeds food lost, which means food that's lost post-harvest or in the transportation and processing phases. But you can see in other regions, like in South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the blue circle is really big, which means a lot of food is lost immediately post-harvest. So this means it's really a global challenge. It's something that there's opportunities to think about across the globe, even while there's some variation in what the solutions are going to be. And overall, this amounts to about 1.3 billion tons of food loss and waste per year. That's about a third of the global food supply. So one reason to care about this is that there's great evidence showing the impact on food loss and waste on climate change. So this is from a UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report from 2019 that looked at all the ways that land and agriculture use were contributing to climate change. And the finding related to food waste was that global food loss and waste contributes about 8 to 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. And there's lots of important things that we can do to reduce the impacts of climate change, but reducing food loss and waste in some ways can be a really beneficial one because it benefits people by getting food to people. There can be, economic benefits to using that food as a resource. So it's really a triple bottom line solution, unlike some other solutions that might have some clear winners and losers within those. So specifically, what I'm going to talk about today is the issue that at the same time that 1.3 billion tons of food is lost or wasted globally, as many as 828 million people, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, suffer from hunger. And there's, as to waste, as I mentioned, this is really a global phenomenon. The parts of the food chain where this occurs might vary from country to country, but there's really no region that is not struggling with this challenge. And because of the climate impacts and the food security impacts, it's emerged as a global goal in recent years. Here in the US, we have a global goal to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. Many peer countries have goals like that too. As to the sort of hunger side of the equation, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that the number of people facing chronic undernourishment may have increased as much as 118 to 161 million people due to COVID. So that number has only been increasing the last few years and making it an even more important challenge. And then, as we see some of the aftershocks of COVID and the food security challenges coming from the Russia-Ukraine war, the food security has really jumped to be front and center for many countries. So food donation, much of the food that's wasted is safe and edible, not all of it, of course, but much of it is safe and edible. And food donation can really play a vital role in making sure that that food that has been harvested and packaged and processed and is ready to eat makes it into the hands of those in need instead of being wasted. Only a quarter of the wasted food globally, if that were redirected, could more than support the food needs of those that are undernourished. And according to our partners at the Global Food Banking Network, 75 million people relied on food banks to address emergency food needs last year, just of the food banks in their network. So why is all of this food wasted despite the need? Well, there are a number of reasons, but I'm going to focus on one big one, which is that government, through laws and policies, plays a really key role in whether or not that food makes it to people in need instead of to the trash. So why does that happen? One reason is that there's confusion over laws. Often food donation isn't mentioned anywhere in food safety laws. So there's a lot of confusion about whether it's even legal to donate surplus food in certain settings. There can be barriers embedded in the laws, such as requirements that are really costly to meet, or even economic barriers. I'll talk about some in a little bit that can make it more cost effective to throw food away than to give it to a food bank or a food recovery organization. And then also there's often a real lack of incentive. So it's sort of, even if it doesn't cost more to donate the food than it does to waste it, it's certainly, there's inertia. It's much easier to keep doing what you've been doing unless there's an alignment of those incentives. So a critical solution in our sort of theory of the case has been to adopt clear and comprehensive laws and regulations for food donation. And while this seems like a simple solution, what we've seen is that very few countries have legal frameworks in place that directly address or effectively support food recovery and donation. So this sort of led to the genesis of the project that I'm going to tell you about, which is our Global Food Donation Policy Atlas. We partnered starting in 2019 with a group called the Global Food Banking Network, which is based here in the US and provides funding and technical assistance, training, networking, et cetera, to food banking organizations around the globe, primarily in lower income countries. They operate in more than 40 countries. And what we've partnered to do is to really identify and analyze the laws related to food donation and the common legal barriers in some of the countries where they have partners. So when we first started this, we committed to work in 15 countries over 2 years. We are now in 23 countries. And I'll talk a little bit about that methodology on the next slide. The goal is really to explain the laws in those countries and compare them across countries, to develop recommendations for policy change that are really tailored to those individual countries based on what's really like most problematic, or the biggest challenges that we hear from the partners and businesses in those countries. We're also working to create a platform for global engagement so that countries can connect with one another, and then also countries that are not part of the project can access this information, learn about some of the best practices. And then we've held a series of different webinars that were really focused on government officials communicating and learning about some of the best practices. And then now we're also working in some of the countries to deliver technical assistance and go deeper if there's like a particular topic that's come up for them as a real challenge, really helping stakeholders there try to move the needle on that topic. So this is just a little bit about the methodology, because I think it's important. There's a way that you can do this work that is like just sitting here in the US and doing research on countries' laws and reporting on it. And for lots of reasons, one of which is that we're a clinic, so I'm really focused on the students having the more hands-on opportunity, but also because I think there can be a lot of bias in doing comparative law, you know, and you know, not getting into the richness of what's really going on and what are real problems and how the law really functions. So our methodology has been really focused on working hand in hand with partners in country. We work with Global Food Banking Network to select countries where there are, you know, some of the focus has been on geographic diversity, countries that have really strong food bank organizations that are really going to be able to take the time to partner with us and make sure we're understanding the laws. And then we, you know, kind of have an agreement with that in-country partner before we get started that they want to work with us, they're excited, and that they're, you know, that they're going to co-brand and co-work with us on releasing any of the materials. We do a bunch of legal and policy desk research, which we have found has been easier in some countries than others, not surprisingly. We then do a fact-finding visit or virtual interviews. We were trying to visit all the countries until COVID slowed us down. And so we, of course, had to switch to virtual interviews with some of them. But when possible, we've actually taken teams to visit and do fact-finding and interviewing. We develop the policy recommendations, and then for each country, we vet the legal guide with an in-country legal expert, and then have our in-country partners review the guide and the policy recommendations to make sure that everything resonates, it's accurate, like the recommendations are things that they also support, and we haven't somehow missed the mark with those. And then here's sort of the deliverables, and I'm going to get into a little detail on a couple of the policy areas that I think are really interesting. So one of the big deliverables is an online map where what you can do is select, there's, you know, different policy areas. If you select one of the policy areas, countries will be color coded based on how strong their policy is in that area. So you can see here, I can't remember, I'll show you some in a moment, but you know, this is what one of them would look like, where countries in green means there's a strong policy, red means that there's no policy on that topic. We have the European Union coded in blue for now, because what we have linked at the moment are a whole bunch of other resources that just track different country policies throughout the EU. So we wanted to make those available, but we haven't done our own research color coding. And then for each of the countries included in the research, there are a legal guide, policy recommendations, and a short executive summary in both English for every country, as well as the native language, if that is the case. So you can see here a screenshot of what that page looks like. So just like getting into some of the findings, the most interesting finding of all has been that there are really some core legal issues that have come up in every country. So the way we started this was we had done a lot of work here in the U.S. comparing laws across states and across cities. We actually staff a project not that dissimilar to this, where we show evolution of laws and how strong they are on certain of these topics across states in the U.S. So we did that. But what we decided to do was, for the first year, before we picked our key topics, we went and did visits and interviews in the first 5 countries, which were U.S., Canada, Mexico, Argentina, and India. So we picked a range of countries to really just go in blind and sort of ask, like, what are the major issues that you're facing? What comes up as barriers? We talked to food banks, we talked to businesses, we talked to government, we talked to other nonprofits like orphanages or schools that were using donated food in their programs. And we really identified the key issues that came up again and again. Some of them were the same issues we've looked at here in the US. Date labeling is something that was an early project that really was my start in working on food waste. And that is that a lot of times the labels on products like best by or use by are really confusing to consumers and cause a lot of waste. And I'll talk about date labeling, our global findings, in a minute. Some of them were new. So one example is that we've looked a lot in the US at tax incentives for donation. We have a really strong federal tax incentive for food donation in the US. And also a number of states have implemented tax credits that businesses, or in most states, they're really tailored to farmers, can claim for donating food that help to offset the cost of harvesting that surplus food, transporting it, et cetera. But one thing that was new to us was tax barriers, which came up in a number of countries that have a value added tax, which we don't have in the US. And the issue there was that in some countries, even the donation of food for free was considered a VAT taxable event. So someone needed to pay a value added tax on that food at the moment that it was donated from, let's say, a business or a manufacturer that wasn't going to be able to use it to a nonprofit. So, either the nonprofit had to find money to pay this tax or the business had to do it. And then what we found was even in some countries that had in law said these donations are exempt from VAT, businesses couldn't claim credits for the value added tax that they paid on the raw ingredients, because the way a value added tax works is that there's tax at every level of an ingredient as it moves through the supply chain. So while they could claim a credit for food they threw away in the trash, they couldn't claim the same credit if they donated it. So we've learned a lot along the way as we've gone, but our goal is really now to focus on these 7 key areas and document what countries are doing on them. And then we also, in all of the country research, we include a miscellaneous area that will cover if there's some other important policy area that has come up from our partners that might not be covered by these. So I want to talk about the findings just for 3 of them. And I'm happy in Q&A to talk about any of the others. I just didn't want to drone on for too long, which is possible to do when you're speaking virtually. So I'm going to talk about date labeling, liability protection, and then waste requirements or waste bans and donation requirements, because I think these are an interesting mix. So here you can see the map. If you go to our Atlas webpage and you select from the drop-down menu date labeling, here's what the map looks like. And on the right, there's a lot of words that you don't need to read right now, but just showing that we explain, what the coding is for each of the policy areas. So green in general means that the country has a strong policy. Yellow means it's moderate. Orange means it's more limited, and then red means that there's no policy. And of course, for each of the areas, what makes it a strong versus moderate versus limited varies to some extent. In some cases, it might be like there's a policy on the books, but it's not actually been implemented via regulations. In some cases, it might be that green would be that there's a policy that's national, whereas yellow or orange means that it's only implemented in certain states or provinces within that country. So there's momentum in that direction, but not a national policy. But they vary from policy to policy. So I briefly mentioned before date labeling. We know that the date labels affixed to food products are a major driver of food waste at all levels. So, in terms of donation, sometimes businesses aren't sure if food can be donated past the date. Food banks or food recovery organizations aren't sure if they'll be penalized for having in their possession food that's past the date. And then once it gets to consumers, whether typical households or consumers who are receiving donated food, they don't know if that food is safe after the date. And the interesting thing is that for the large majority of foods, the date on those products, whether it's best before or use by or enjoy by, for the large majority of foods, that date is really a quality or freshness indicator, meaning that food can be really safe and tasty and healthy and fine after the date for most foods. And in a prior project we did in the clinic, we went around tasting expired foods and we made a film about it. And we showed that really we were with food safety experts. We showed that for most foods, there's not really a risk associated with that. So what we found in looking at what countries are doing on this around the globe was really interesting for a couple reasons. One is that we found, as you can see, there's only one country that's green, which is the United Kingdom, and I'll talk about why on the next slide. So they're the only country that we've worked in so far that's had a strong policy. The other really interesting finding is the U.S., as you can see in red, is the only country that we found around the globe where there is no policy on the books surrounding date labels. Rather than having any national rules around those labels on food, in the US, they've left it up to states. So there's a total hodgepodge of state requirements. Some states have date label requirements for milk, some have requirements for eggs, some have requirements for prepackaged sandwiches, but it's really madness. So that was actually an interesting finding, to be able to now bring this back to policymakers in the US and show that not only does it not really make sense, having all these differences from state to state, but that we're really behind the kind of trend globally in terms of not taking a stand on regulating this. The other really interesting thing is that there's some global best practices that have been put out by Codex Alimentarius, which is sort of a global set of food safety and labeling norms. So let me move to the next slide so I can talk about what a strong policy looks like. So the Codex Alimentarius recommends that the best practice for date labels is that there should be standard labels that clearly distinguish between food that's labeled for quality, meaning, it's going to be fresh before this date, but that there's no risk afterwards, versus food that's labeled for safety, meaning for this food, the risk can increase over time, and you should really be cautious about eating it before the date. So the United Kingdom is the only country that we've worked in so far that we thought really had a strong policy. One thing that they do is they standardize labels on products. You can see a picture here of the two standard labels that they have, which are best before for food that's labeled for quality reasons, or use by for food that's labeled for safety reasons. And they also, this comes out of the EU food information regulation. So the UK previously was in the EU, and they've retained a lot of EU law. So, EU-wide, this is sort of what's required. And then the other really interesting thing that the UK does really well is that they clearly state that food can't be donated or sold after the use by date, but food that has a best before date can be donated, can be consumed. There's been a lot of both explicit law stating that, and then kind of education campaigns and resources for businesses, for food recovery organizations, and for consumers, helping people to really understand that food past the best before date is still safe and healthy. And as long as it tastes and smells good, there should be no problem with it. So, helps people save food and save money. One of the other areas I wanted to talk about was liability protection for food donations. So as you can see here, this is one of the policy areas where the US has a strong policy, as well as Argentina. And I'll kind of talk about why on the next slide. But the idea here is that many food businesses are really concerned about donating food because they are fearful that if they donate food and then someone were to get sick from that, that they could be sued and held liable for the injuries resulting from that recipient. And it's a particular issue because particularly in countries where food donation and food recovery is fairly new, businesses, they might say, I know this food is safe when it leaves my hands, but if I'm giving it to a nonprofit organization, how do I know that they're not going to make a mistake, that they're not going to hold on to it too long or not package it well? Like, I can't trust this other organization that's not part of my business supply chain. So that's become a barrier for donation in many countries. And we've also seen that in creating liability protection not only helps to set the minds of businesses at ease, but in some countries where there's no clear statement that food donation is not mentioned in law anywhere, this also just helps to ease the barrier for businesses and knowing that food donation is allowed, it's acceptable, and it's a priority for countries to make sure that food that otherwise would be wasted gets to those in need. So this has been an interesting area because it's been growing in recent years. One country that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, where we are about to publish information, is Ecuador. So Ecuador recently also passed some liability protection. And you can see there's a lot of variability. So, I mentioned the US and Argentina are strong. Canada, we put as moderate because there's not a national level protection, but every province within Canada has enacted some sort of protection for food donors within that provincial law. And then Mexico also offers some limited protection for the donors of food. So there's like some, interesting emerging trends around that. In terms of why the US and Argentina are the strongest, it's because they both provide protection that is at the national level, that protects both the donors of food and then also the food recovery organizations, as long as the food complies with all safety rules. So of course, if you are a business in the U.S. or in Argentina, you know that your food was contaminated with like a microbiological contaminant or a physical adulterant, like a piece of metal or something like that, and you donate it, you will not be protected. This is only for businesses that know that the food, to their belief, complies with all of the food safety rules. In the U.S., the food has to be given to a nonprofit. It has to, comply with all of the food safety rules. The nonprofit that receives the food must pass it along at no cost to the end recipient, and it must go to needy individuals. And Argentina is framed slightly differently. It protects the donors of food and the food recovery organizations. Donors can give food either directly to people in need or through a nonprofit organization. And it presumes good faith on the part of the donors and organizations that if the food met all safety rules, it's presumed that they donated in good faith. And that puts a burden on end recipients to show that something was done wrong along the way. And I should say that we have not found any cases. There's certainly no cases in the US of suits against food businesses for harm resulting from donated food. We haven't really found evidence of this globally, but it remains a concern on the part of businesses, both as a cost or as a concern in terms of like their brand and just getting poor blowback if they're brought into court. And so I think this has been of interest in a lot of countries. The last area I want to talk about a little bit is waste penalties and donation requirements. So as you can see here, we do not yet have any country that's on here in green as a strong policy. It's been kind of an emerging policy. And in fact, many of the countries where we're working have been enacting these policies while we're working with them. So, Ecuador, which I'll talk about on the next slide, the month we kicked off our work with Ecuador earlier this year, they had a draft law. We worked with them on reviewing it that has created a requirement for donation of edible foods. So it's sort of, coming fast and furious. And it's been really interesting to see how these vary from country to country. Because most countries haven't really enacted something at the national level, what we've included as moderate would be countries where there's a number of state or provincial policies that are doing this at the local level, or in some countries like Peru, there was legislation passed that was really strong, but because it's been several years and there haven't yet been any implementing regulations, it's not enforced yet. So we sort of said, we're going to wait and see once you enforce it, what that actually looks like. And the idea behind these is really that either there's a penalty or a tax on businesses if they throw food away, which they don't have to donate it, but we've seen that, for example, in states in the U.S. that have this, there's been a big increase in donation. Vermont is a great example. There was a big increase in donation when the state started prohibiting food being sent to the landfill. And then others are framed as an actual requirement on donation that businesses must, with any edible food, must donate it or must show good reason why they didn't, if that food is edible and safe. So I'm going to talk about two examples here. I mentioned Ecuador. The image at the top is this new law in Ecuador, the law to prevent and reduce food loss and waste and reduce the hunger of people in vulnerable situations. It's brand new. It passed this year, and the government of Ecuador right now is working on regulations to implement it. And the way that the law works in Ecuador, it was actually quite interesting, a very comprehensive law that implements a bunch of different recommendations from our Atlas project, including a donation requirement, liability protection, some next steps on date labels. The way that the ban works is that there's a ban on destroying food that is fit for human consumption. And then there's like a hierarchy of where that food can go, with donation being at the top, feeding that to animals where appropriate, or using it for renewable energy or compost, all above throwing it in the landfill. It applies to anybody, whether national or foreign, involved in the production, processing, distribution, marketing, and importation of food products. They're not allowed to destroy food. And if they destroy food, they have the burden of justifying that decision. And then there are actually quite strict sanctions, which again, we'll see how the regulations end up implementing it, but sanctions against individuals or businesses that would throw food away. The other spotlight I'll give is the U.S., where, as I mentioned, there's nothing at the federal level, but you can see a map here of a growing number of states and localities that have implemented versions of this. So as one example, Massachusetts, where I live, has a ban on businesses sending a certain amount of food to landfill per week. So it's meant to really capture larger businesses. Until 2022, that threshold was that you couldn't send more than 1 ton of food to the landfill per week. And now it's reduced to a half ton starting this November. And then some states have now implemented donation requirements. So California is the furthest ahead. There's the first phase of it went into effect this year. They have a statewide goal that 20% of edible food be donated, but the state agency that was implementing this recognized that to meet that 20% goal, certain food can't be donated, like food that's left over in people's households, the leftovers you brought home from dinner, like some of that can't be donated. So they basically said to meet that overall 20% goal, certain businesses must donate all of their surplus food. So starting this year, that has applied to wholesale, food service providers, large grocery stores, distributors, and then in a couple of years, that will also capture smaller businesses like restaurants and hotels and health facilities and hospitals. So 2 other things just to add on to it. I mean, I know I didn't go through all the areas of law, but all of them have been really interesting. There's so much creativity out there, and we've had an amazing experience learning about it and sharing. One thing we've now started putting out because of the goal to really help other countries that aren't part of this is issue briefs with the best practices on different areas. So these are the 3 that we've published so far. And they're, 8 to 10 pages that really go over what is the issue, why is this a policy priority, and then what are the best practices that we've seen on the ground. We've done webinars with policymakers on these and other issues that are underway. And we also on our website now link to for each of the areas of policy, the example policy from one of the countries that we think has a really strong one, so people can actually get directly to that law. And so the future of the Atlas, I mean, this project's been amazing. We have the countries you see here, research is ongoing. We'll be publishing a number of them in the next month, including Ghana, Nigeria, Indonesia, and Ecuador. Those are going to be the next wave that will come out. And then we're doing technical assistance in some of the countries, which has also been really interesting. It's given us a chance to go deeper. So I'll just give as one example, one of the countries where we're doing technical assistance is South Africa. And they, among the policies, they selected that they would like better guidance on food safety for donations. Their laws right now don't mention donation anywhere in their food safety laws. And there's an opportunity both to make it more clear what food can be donated and make sure that food doesn't go to waste, but also there's an opportunity to make sure that everything that's donated is truly safe. So that was one. And then also they don't have any liability protection, and we're interested in really showing the demand amongst companies that these are 2 policy areas where making a change would actually have an impact. So we've partnered with Food Forward South Africa, which is our NGO partner there, that is the food bank network in South Africa, and then with their trade association for the food industry to conduct a survey of businesses on their feelings on food safety for donations, what's clear, what could be clearer in the food safety rules, and then on whether the lack of liability protection is a challenge and whether having some protection in law would convince their companies to donate more. So we're actually right now in the last phases of analyzing some of that research, and we'll be publishing that. We had about 60 companies in South Africa reply to that survey, and then we'll put it in the hands of our partners to try to move forward on making change. We're hoping to hold an in-person summit. We've been doing webinars because that was challenging with COVID, but that is something that's in our work plan for next year. And then we're trying to figure out what else. And I put that on here because I'm curious in the Q&A if people also have ideas, or if you want to send me an email at any point. We're trying to figure out what else we could add on to this. We have so much information now, and we're trying to really think about what else we could add on that would be useful, or what other ways to package some of the findings that would be really helpful. So I'll just put up here the link to the atlas, which I can put in the chat. Although I don't actually, I guess on the live stream, you wouldn't be able to chat, but now you have it. The link to the atlas, the link to our website, which has many other resources on food loss and waste policy and many other areas that we work in, and my email address.
Thank you, Emily. That was awesome. I feel like I learned a lot. I hadn't known too much about this project. So we have a bunch of questions that have come through. So I'll just jump right in. And just as a reminder, you can enter questions in the YouTube channel. There's a box on the right side, and also through the Facebook page. There's a few questions that came in about kind of how this relates to the US, and I'll just kind of read a few because they seem to kind of group together pretty well. How do you see this work fitting in with your work advocating for a national food strategy in the US and elsewhere? What opportunities are there for US policymakers? Are there bills pending in Congress in the US that advocates are organizing support for? And how would they change US policy? And is there a priority in terms of a policy that would really change things and make it easier in the US to reduce food waste? So that's kind of like, let's hear what you have to say about that first.
All right, so let me try to answer those, and then you can tell me if I missed any. But
Yeah.
it's funny because like I don't get to see the questions before they come in, so you know, get to. So one thing that's been amazing in this project is, like, when we started out, I think we had this instinct of, we know a lot about things here and we can share some of that globally, but we always, you know, also had this sense of, you know, getting more engaged with what's going on in the rest of the world could help us here. And I don't even think I realized how much that was the case until we got into the meat of this, because there are so many countries that I think are really out ahead of where we are. And so I've been very good about making sure that our like US policymakers have joined these webinars we've done with government officials and heard about the creativity coming from around the globe. I'll talk about a couple things going on domestically that I think are really interesting. One is that there's food waste has been a priority for, you know, the past, I don't know, at least like 7 or 8 years in the US when we first announced a national food waste reduction goal. And it's really spanned both political parties, which is great. There's like bipartisan interest in it. And so at the beginning of 2021, we partnered with ReFed, WWF, and NRDC. We'd all kind of worked together over time on different things, but we partnered to put out a real food loss and waste policy action plan for the US that we worked on together that had like 5 key areas. And what was amazing was that we got sign on to that plan from, you know, tons of different businesses and local governments and NGOs, like big businesses like Google and Marriott and, you know, Kroger, Hyatt, all these groups signed on. So now we've been working on like, okay, everyone agrees we should do these things. How do we make it happen? And not surprisingly, it's really tricky. Like, you know, even things that seem easy, just the way that Congress works and that things are structured can be really difficult. So a couple of things that I would say are priorities. There was, you know, date labeling has been a really big priority for me. We have really good data on like the waste and the confusion in the US that's caused by it. And I think especially as we've seen rising rates of food insecurity, it just makes more sense to kind of give people the tools. Like, to me, it's really like an economic justice issue that people are throwing food away because they want to stay safe and they don't realize that they're just like wasting their money. So that's been a priority. We've been focusing a lot on the next US Farm Bill in terms of funding opportunities. And I would say my like number one dream would be funding for states to plan and implement these waste bans and donation requirements. It takes a lot of work on states to like figure out what they want to do, communicate about it, enforce it. And so like having planning grants for states to kind of think about what's right for them, and then implementation once they figure out what they want to do to build the infrastructure. Like California investing a lot more in their food rescue infrastructure to be able to implement their law, and being able to like have money from the federal level to support that. Did I answer all your questions? I'm trying to think. There was also actually a couple weeks ago, there was a really big like Hill Day around a bill called the Food Donation Improvement Act, which would clarify and expand some of the liability protections in the U.S. that I mentioned, which are really strong, but we also now, 25 years of that law, we've seen that there's some weaknesses. And so there's a fair amount of energy towards like making that clear and updating it.
No, that's super helpful. That's great. I'm going to ask just a couple more because I've been told that we have to wrap up around 12:55. So we have a time for a few more. So another question is, are you concerned at all about food transport costs and impacts? Wouldn't it make sense to connect food insecure countries with food options that are in close proximity to the country that's in need?
That's a great question. It's really interesting. Most of the work we're doing is primarily been around like food that's already in country and making sure that that gets to people in need. Although it has come up in a few countries that are very import dependent, they've raised to us issues about like challenges with like importing food for donation. And so we'll mention those where they're relevant. But for the most part, we've really looked at food that's available in countries. We're not so much focused on like food aid or moving of food from one part of the globe to another. And I think the answer to that too is that there's so much food already available in countries that's being wasted. So it can hopefully address some of the questions with these transport costs that, and like the, global kind of insecurity related to the grain issues coming out of Russia and Ukraine. But that said, I mean, transport costs are higher. The higher the transport costs go, the less likely businesses are to donate surplus food if they don't have any tax deduction or any way to offset the cost of like getting that food to food banks or to food pantries.
That's super helpful. A lot to think about there. This question is a little broader. How are the countries measuring food waste? And is it likely an underestimate? And where are those numbers coming from?
That's a really good question. It is really been all over the map. Sometimes when we start in a country, like the first thing that comes up is our partners will say, we actually don't have good data. And we're like, that's a good problem that we can't help you solve because we don't really, like we can't bring a team in and like track their waste. And so I think, on a global level, like having better data would be great. There are a couple data points that are at the global level that I think are based on a hodgepodge of data and some modeling. The global data I mentioned on like 1/3 of food waste, that's an FAO data point. UN Environmental Program does a lot of work on this. They actually came out with a really great report. Trying to think if it was like last summer, I think, that was updated data on household level food waste around the globe, which was super interesting because prior to that, I think most people thought household food waste was primarily an issue in wealthier countries. Like in the US, more than 30% of all of our food waste occurs at households. But this new UN environmental program resource found that even in lower income countries, there's a lot of household level food waste. So, it's spotty though. I think there's like a real opportunity to standardize and increase that data. One other resource I'll mention is the World Resources Institute has this food loss and waste protocol that is intended to help countries better report on their food loss and waste. And so some countries are using that, but again, it's really spotty as far as, whether we even have our arms around how much waste is happening in certain countries.
Yeah, lots of issues with data. Interesting to think about. So I think I'm going to do one more and then we'll probably have to wrap up. So somebody asked a question. They said, I'm surprised to hear about varying state requirements for date labels, as I understood the issue with Vermont's GMO label law to be that companies sell products in multiple states. And why do you think industry hasn't prompted some standardization?
That's a really great question. Thoughtful question by whoever asked it. So we've raised this a lot too. We've sort of said, like, isn't it good for companies if we standardize these? And, frankly, I mean, first of all, if we think these dates are linked to safety or food science, then you would see states having similar laws, but we're not seeing that. They're just really all over the map. What it seems like happens is most states require date labels on certain foods, and a number of states restrict sale or donation after that date. But there's, enough of them are close enough, or like if one state requires date labels on eggs and another requires them on milk, a company can still sell to that, they can comply with both of those at the same time. So companies will kind of look at, like, in this region, like let's say in New England or in the Northeast, what is the common denominator of some of these labels, and they can kind of meet all of them. So it's not become enough of a burden on them to get them to really come to the negotiating table. Although a number of states, like as a result of this concern about food waste and the economic hardship to families, are proposing new bills. And I think as you see more legislation proposed, then you start to see bigger national companies say, maybe it's just easier to have one solution. So one big thing that the main trade associations in the U.S. did a few years ago was that they developed a voluntary date labeling initiative that they're recommending all of their companies align with. So it would be similar to what I talked about: a standard label, best by or best if used by on products labeled for quality, and then a standard used by label on products labeled for safety, which is great. But then we kind of came out with data showing, in more than half of states, you can't actually apply that to all of the foods. So if the goal is to make it clear to consumers, we're not actually going to get there without really requiring this at the national level. But it's a really thoughtful question. And I know, the example of like GMO labeling, shows what's possible. I think if businesses feel like in the end, it would be easier for them to just get behind a national standard.
Yeah, exactly. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up for the day. This has been such a great conversation and presentation by you, Emily. There's so much to learn. There's a lot of food for thought, no pun intended. And I'm just going to make sure that I'm saying everything I have to say. So yeah, basically, thanks again, Professor Broad Leib, for your presentation. And thank you for everyone that joined us and is viewing this on the different Facebook and YouTube channels. And again, this concludes our entire Hot Topic series for this summer. So thanks for all of you that joined for the whole thing. And if you would like to watch any of the ones of the past, they're all available on the Vermont Law and Graduate School YouTube channel. So with that, we're going to conclude, and I hope everybody has a good rest of their week. And if you're in Vermont, New England, stay cool. And thanks again, Emily.
Thanks.
Bye.